Greetings, I'm Brother Judah, a member of the Congregation of Israel, a representative of the NMP, the Nazarene Messianic Party. We'd like to thank you all for whoever takes the time to listen to our podcast, What is to be Done? Here we investigate geopolitical, historical, biblical, social, and other scientific content. Today, we want to continue a discussion dealing with Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., the Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. files. We want to look into the FBI files. And we want to link Dr. MLK up with history. It's a very interesting connection with Dr. Martin Luther King and other revolutionary activity that was going on even before Dr. MLK. But one of the motivations for dealing with this is that there seemed to have arisen once again an anti-MLK message. At one time, full disclosure, that I had my fair share of bad things to say about Dr. MLK, and I will argue primarily it was because of my ignorance. And so reading more and learning more, and then actually reading and studying Dr. MLK books, I have been able to understand more of his argument and also notice the profound insight in which he had pertaining to liberation. You have some now arguing that Dr. Martin Luther King, he wasn't a Christian, he was a Marxist. Let me say this, that Dr. MLK began to question conventional Christianity. And Dr. MLK began to learn more or be influenced by students of Karl Marx via the Communist Party USA. And so therefore, this idea that Dr. Martin Luther King was leaning more towards atheism isn't true. He rejected the organized church. But normally when people say Marxism, and we're not talking about the Marxism of modern day. When I'm making reference to Marxism, I primarily make reference to the students of Karl Marx, not people who call themselves Marxists today. And I do the same thing with Christianity. The Christianity of today is totally different than the Christianity of the early assembly of Jews, led by a peasant prophet, as the Romans would have identified him as, named Yeshua ben David. However, this Yeshua ben David was called and anointed Hamashiach, which is Christ. Now, that movement was very different from Christianity you hear or learn about today. God willing, we'll discuss that in further or another podcast. Same thing with Marx. Karl Marx himself, he rejected organized religion, so he began to be labeled an atheist. But Karl Marx father and grandfather were actually Torah teachers, or some will call Jewish rabbis. So he was familiar with the Bible that Jesus read. So some people say, what do you mean the Bible that Jesus read? Well, you know, the Bible that Jesus read, Jesus didn't have, or Yeshua ben David, he didn't have Corinthians, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, or Titus or Thessalonians. Um, Jesus' Bible would have been the book you are all familiar with calling the Old Testament. Now, these are all other discussions. I'm just trying to put things in perspective. Marx rejected organized religion. You really can't say he was an atheist. Martin Luther King rejected organized religion, but he wasn't an atheist. Um, Martin Luther King began to be indirectly a student of Karl Marx and his political development, but he wouldn't be called a Marxist how you understand a Marxist to be today. And we want to look into this connection between Dr. Martin Luther King and the communist. Why is it that today he's being rejected, uh, being called a atheist or Marxist, and and just simply rejecting Christianity? No, he's rejecting the traditional Romish church. That's what he began to question. And what else is important for us to understand, I would say, is that Dr. Martin Luther King and his position, um, he dealt with what some would call liberation theology. He began to be baptized into that school of thought. And Martin Luther King also began to develop enemies among his own so called race because Martin Luther King early movement with integration, uh, it caused a rift with the monopoly that the black bourgeoisie had over African Americans. And you see a lot of the black bourgeoisie today who's championing this discrediting of Dr. Martin Luther King, but they did it in his day. There was a lot of those who ate at the king's table who made it known that they didn't care for Dr. Martin Luther King and that he should go about his business. And I'm talking about black preachers and businessmen and everything else. We need to talk about the black bourgeoisie too in other discussions because they seem to go uh, untouched because they can hide behind this mythical doctrine, which have gained a lot of ground and actually settled in the minds of people. Uh, this mythical doctrine of race and identity politic. And so now your enemies, because they so-called look like you, are able to come and give you a kiss on the cheek while they're planning your demise. We argue at the NMPs about a class struggle, and we willing to defend that position. But the black bourgeoisie then and now have a problem with Martin because the black bourgeoisie had a monopoly because the so-called African American or the Negro people couldn't spend money nowhere else. And so therefore fortunes were made off the backs of the black bourgeoisie. And there is a percentage of this black bourgeoisie also uh, who were slave owners. And you found this also in Haiti. And after the revolution, a lot of the so-called black freedmen who actually owned slaves made it to the mainland. And so some of the enemies to the oppressed working class African American um, can go unnoticed because they look like you. If they argue Jesus of Nazareth was a black man, for example, well, black man betrayed him. Yehuda Iscariot, Fred Hampton, a black man betrayed him. Denmark Vesey, a black man, betrayed him. And then after he betrayed the uh, the movement of Denmark Vesey, then this same black person, from what I've read, uh, I forget his name at the moment, but he wound up getting like a stipend, a yearly stipend of $50, and that was quite a bit of money back then. And lo and behold, he went and bought slaves. So we need to put things in order, uh, because the liberation of man, the toilers, um, it is high time that we work towards that as our ancestors, white and black, Asian, Latino. It's important for us to really understand what our fight is against. So Martin Luther King, after he began to question the church, the Western Christian church, he began to get educated in um, politics, and he began to be trained in communist schools. Now, notice this carefully before we go further. What we have here, MLK, Martin Luther King at Communist Training School. And today we will be reading from the United States Government Memorandum, Federal Bureau of Investigation, subject Martin Luther King Jr., file number 100-106670. Okay, that's what we're going to look at for today's session. And we want to put some history together because there is an interesting connection between Karl Marx and Martin Luther King and Abraham Lincoln, whether you believe it or not. It's a very, very interesting connection, or a bridge, I should say. But Martin Luther King at Communist Training School, and this is what we have, this picture to our left, and we have labeled Martin Luther King number 1. They label him as a false prophet and traitor. We have Abner Berry, he's number 2, the brother who's up front. I think that's a plaid shirt or something he have on. And then we have Aubrey Williams, which is number 3. And then we have Miles Horton. All of these are so-called communists. And Martin Luther King is there. And the FBI files is going to address this. Now, Martin Luther King began to understand more political theory. As we said in our last session, he was encouraged by a Walter Rauschenbusch dealing with liberation theology. And to add to his knowledge and understanding of geopolitics and social sciences, Martin began to be trained by the communists. And we're going to look and see how the FBI noted this. And the communist part in the so-called Negro liberation movement of the 60s. And one question that I have is that the FBI was really concerned about not letting the communists, as the FBI put it, exploit the Negro. And they went through great measures and said it was very important, desperate even, that they don't let the communists gain ground among the Negro. And I start thinking to myself, well, if people was to sit down and just consider that for a moment, if you consider those who sat in seats of power really didn't care about the so-called African American or the Negro, why wouldn't they want the communists to make grounds among the Negro? Is it because the communists were bad and they cared for Black people? Did the FBI really care for Black people? Didn't want them to become victims of the communists? We need to look at another discussion. I believe it's Claude McKay, as he's going to entertain that discussion as well, or entertain that question. But just give it a little time, and we're going to introduce some more of these things and bring it to the table. And again, remember, we approach things from a socio-political perspective, a geopolitical, biblical perspective. We're Bible believers, but we're not traditional religious organization. Now, notice Martin's shift. And I want you to listen out of his own mouth, because so many people speak for him. But I want us to get a glimpse of what he was saying himself. And notice, and I want you to listen carefully as Dr. Martin Luther King, he began to argue that racial injustice and economic injustice can only be solved with a radical redistribution of economic power and political power. Economic power, the power of economics. Economics doesn't necessarily mean money. Economics deals with housekeeping, keeping house, distribution of goods, food, shelter, clothing, nutrition, livable conditions, humane livable conditions. The power to determine that, and the power to determine our economics, is found in political power. So he's putting these two together. So listen carefully.
We must also realize that the problems of racial injustice and economic injustice cannot be solved without a radical redistribution of political and economic power.
Dr. King argued that the problems of racial injustice and economic injustice cannot be solved without a radical redistribution of economic power and political power. See, when we say economics, traditionally people think of just money and cash. When you're saying economic power, you're talking about having power over resources. Okay, not necessarily having your own factory, but owning the resource that goes into the factory and manufactured to produce a commodity. Having power over the ores, if you're going to manufacture iron and cast iron piping, or iron beams, okay? Having power over the resources of sand mines, if you're going to manufacture glass. Having power over the plantations of timber, if you're going to manufacture 2x4s and wood for building. Okay, so when we're talking about this, we're talking about power over resource. We seem to be limited in our way of thinking, primarily because we're not trained to think above being a consumer. So the resource of water and oil and gas, timber, and the ores of the earth, these are resources. And these resources are used for our well-being or our housekeeping, building our houses. manufacturing clothes and shoes. All that come from resources. And these resources are allocated and distributed by way of political power. So we're not talking about necessarily cash. Don't matter how much cash you have. Those who own the resources just keep hiking up the price and hiking up the price. All right. So we need to understand his position. Why am I arguing this, and why am I saying he's coming from this position? Because he's being trained by a communist and he's going into communist schools. And I happen to be a little bit familiar with the teachings of the communist training schools. So economic and political power. This is what Dr. Martin Luther King is arguing. And let us look at it again as he quotes a little bit more of this. And listen carefully. This is, people like to pigeonhole Dr. King when he was 20 or 26. We got to listen to what he was saying afterwards. So this next clip, not this one before you, this clip is going to address the Vietnam War and the imperial aggression of the Americas in Vietnam, and how the poor whites and poor blacks were carrying the burden of the taxes to pay for the war, and also carrying the burden of the casualties, because it's the poor children who bloodshed is on the battlefields, who's shedding blood on the battlefield. So he's addressing that, but that's not our subject today. I want you to notice the clip after this one. I try to cue it up as close as possible, but notice.
Bear the heaviest burdens both at the front and at home. The other thing I want you to understand is this, that it didn't cost the nation one penny to integrate lunch counters. It didn't cost the nation one penny to guarantee the right to vote. But now we are dealing with issues that cannot be solved without the nation spending billions of dollars and undergoing a radical redistribution of economic power. Yeah.
Dr. King began to talk about a radical redistribution of economic power and political power. Where was he getting these ideas? Walter Rauschenbusch was one. Liberation theology. Another source is argued from the communists. Now, to look at this carefully, we're going to go back to the training schools of the communists, and then give a historical contextual background looking at the United States government memorandum. Federal Bureau of Investigation, subject Martin Luther King Jr., file number 100-1066670. And on page 163, it is we're going to just do a brief history war. We're going to walk our way up. So what we find is that this is a memorandum to Mr. Rosen, and it's concerning subject Martin Luther King Jr. So they're going to give a briefing of him, the FBI. Now remember, this isn't information that the FBI is trying to persuade the public with. This is information within their own ranks. And this what makes it so powerful, is because we're going to find out what they were thinking, not what they wanted us to think they were thinking. These are their ideas and their concerns among each other. This wasn't public. Okay, so let us keep that in mind. Martin Luther King Jr., Reverend Martin Luther King Jr., prominent integrationalist who led bus boycott in Montgomery, Alabama, and sit-in demonstrations, has been associated with National Association for the Advancement of Colored People and Congress of Racial Equality. So these are briefings. So this isn't a novel, so these are their notes. All right. King has not been investigated by the FBI. So as of this time, he had not been investigated. All right. So he started his work in the 50s. All right. So it says the Bureau files reveal King thanks Socialist Workers Party for support of bus boycott. So first they're noting, okay, well, he have come in contact with the Socialist Party. That's important because I want to bring some information to you about the Socialist Party some 40 years prior. The FBI have been taking note of the Socialist Party for the last 4 decades as of this writing in the 60s. All right, going all the way back to the 20s. Why? Because we have read the meetings and stuff like that and read through that literature. So when we got our hands on the FBI files, it was really making a lot of sense. But if you're not familiar with the history, you might not recognize it. So we just want to share it with you and just take some things to think about, because what we have before us today as toilers, white, Black, Latinos, you have some who have monetary gain, but the great majority of the people are still toiling and exploited, barely can pay bills, many homeless. It's just really a stressful situation throughout the globe. And so in order to change the conditions, we must understand what is going on. Okay. And so we can recognize who the enemy really is. And as I say, we approach this from a biblical, social, political perspective. So our argument isn't any ethnicity or race. According to Torah teacher, who they call Paul, Shaul of Tarsus, he argued that, which he received this argument from the Tanakh, or what they call the Old Testament. He argued that our warfare isn't against flesh and blood, but against systems, principalities and powers. Okay, so governments. And when we're looking at government, we're looking at governmental systems. All right. And the liberation for mankind, is to come about by the movement of Yeshua ben David, which movement was just a revival of the early peasant, anti-feudal, anti-capitalist movement started by Moses, by the hand of the Creator. You say capitalism, it wasn't industrial capitalism. We have proletariat, but we're looking at primitive capitalism. And it can be argued that primitive capitalism is simply feudalism. Well, Moses' movement with escaped slaves was to go and carve out a new society of free producers that wasn't subjugated nor exploited by a minority ruling class. And this movement, which was a federal movement, a covenant, a united covenant or a confederacy of 12 tribes who went and set forth to carve out a new social system. Now, we could prove this in other teachings, So this is Jesus of Nazareth context. And so this movement is to challenge the powers as it was ordained to do in its inception. So Jesus of Nazareth said, or Yeshua ben David said, you shall be hated of kings and governors for my name's sake. Okay, they're not just they're gonna have a problem with you because of your struggle against injustice. And again, God willing, we will prove this and bring this out in further discussions, and also discussions we have in house. We don't necessarily put them online, but if you're interested in our teachings, you could reach out and contact us and ask more questions, or get into more of our teachings with scriptorial base, which possibly can answer some questions for those of the people who are searching the Bible for answers and they're struggling with modern day religion, just like Martin did. Maybe we can have dialogue and help in that area, possibly. But nevertheless, the mission was or is to challenge the principalities and powers. It's really not about a race, white man, black man, Latino man, none of that. And and again, we can argue that and believe we could defend this position in the name of the Creator. So Martin, he was being associated with this socialist. And the NAACP. And out of the NAACP brings us into another figure that I would like to discuss, God willing, is W.E.B. Du Bois, who was also converted to communism. Paul Robeson, also converted to communism. And the list goes on. But the FBI noticed that Martin Luther King thanks Socialist Workers Party. So he's in contact with the Socialist Workers Party, and Martin Luther King was honorary chairman of the Young Socialist League campaign on behalf of victims of racist terror. Now, let's put this in context for a minute, because I want to go back and forth to put this in perspective. I would like to go back and forth so people can understand. You see this, we had dealt with this before and showed you the flyer. And I just want you to just take this into consideration, all right? This flyer here is from the 1940s. This predates Martin Luther King, but it gives you this idea of what we're dealing with here. So we have the FBI, who is anti-communist. And many can argue that those who were sitting in seats of authority or part of the authorities, FBI, police, and sitting in seats of government, many of them were either apologists or members of the Ku Klux Klan. We have this flyer here. Now, remember, Martin Luther King thanked the Socialist Workers Party for support of the bus boycott when Martin was challenging the capitalists who dominated the transportation sector. Then we have, he was an honorary chairman of the Young Socialist League on behalf of victims of racist terror. Look what these are the socialists and communists. They're helping in the bus boycott, not just for the sake of sitting on a bus per se. I mean, if people want to be that simple, they could narrow it down to that, but it's the principle of human and equal rights. So we have Negroes beware, do not attend communist meetings. Paid organizers of the communists are only trying to get Negroes in trouble. Alabama is a good place for good Negroes to live in, but it is a bad place, notice this, for Negroes who believe in social equality. The flyer bear witness that the communists are fighting for Negroes' social equality. So it makes sense. They're helping in the bus boycott for their civil and equal rights. And they are also um, campaigning against those who are bringing forth terrorist acts against the so-called Negro, the Negroes who have been victims of racist terror. So it has the Ku Klux Klan is watching you. Take heed. Tell the communist leaders to leave. Report all communist meetings to the Ku Klux Klan. And eventually these meetings began to be reported to the FBI. Why? Is it because the FBI is so concerned at this time with Black people that they just didn't want Black people to be exploited or harmed? Or what was the problem? Was the FBI, for example, in Martin's day, were they trying to help Black people and save them from the communists? What was the issue? And if we listen to regular propaganda, we will start to believe that the communists were enemies to the so-called Negro, and not even know what the communists actually were teaching. And then if you hear about communism today, then I know it's out the door. I mean, you have people calling themselves communists, and they, against the family and distorting the whole teaching of Engels about the family. He wasn't talking about destroy the family. He was talking about equality within the family. But that's a whole nother subject. But now you have the LGBTQ, you have identity politics, you have a lot of hypocrisy, and people, bear with me a second, a lot of hypocrisy, and people are using this and labeling it Marxism, communism. All right, it's not that way. A little bit more complicated. It's a little bit more information that should be gathered before people come to conclusions, before you hate or begin to discredit something and don't have the information about it. But let's get a little bit more information on this. Now we're going to August 30th, 1963. August 30th, 1963. This is to Mr. A.H. Belmont from Mr. W.C. Sullivan. Communist Party USA, Negro question. It says, reference is made to the enclosed material on which the director has written. This memo reminds me vividly of those I received when Castro took over Cuba. You contended then that Castro and his cohorts were not communist and not influenced by communists. Time alone prove you wrong. For I, for one, can't ignore the memos of King. So the argument here to Mr. Belmont is that we didn't pay close attention to Castro and his association with communists. And we didn't even believe, many of us, that he was communist. We wrong. Now, We don't want to be wrong again, especially not within our borders. We have Dr. Martin Luther King, who's in association with communists and socialists. All right. The director is correct. We were completely wrong about believing the evidence was not sufficient to determine some years ago that Fidel Castro was not a communist or under communist influence. On investigating the writing about communism and the American Negro, we had better remember this and profit by the lesson it should teach us. All right, so now it was one thing for us to ignore Castro, something else was for us to ignore the Negro in communism. I do think that much of the difficulty relating to this memorandum, rightly questioned by the director, is to be found centered in the word, quote, influence, unquote. We do not have, and no government agency or private organization has, any yardstick which can accurately measure influence in this particular context, even when we know it does exist, such as in the case of the obvious influence of communism over Martin Luther King, and King's influence over other Negro leaders. See, they're seeing this bridge. We ignored Castro, and he brought communism to Cuba and kicked all of the rich folks out of Cuba. Now we have Dr. Martin Luther King, who's being influenced by the communists. And he, as they said, the word we're looking at is influence. And Martin Luther King has influence over other Negro leaders. Mr. Sullivan is going to continue. Personally, I believe in the light of King's powerful demagogic speech yesterday, he stands head and shoulders over all other Negro leaders put together when it comes to influencing great masses of Negroes. We must mark him now, if we have not done so before, as the most dangerous Negro of the future in this nation from the standpoint of communism, the Negro, and national security. So they're saying that MLK is he is the most dangerous Negro to the future of this nation. The most. Now, communism has a record. It has a history pertaining to African American and working people's plight. If you would, for this session, before we close, because we want to further read through these FBI documents, but I definitely want to go and make some connections in history and walk our way up. And in doing so, this is 1963. Okay. And Martin Luther King Jr. and his movement is practically 100 years to the date. 100 years to the year, from 1860s, 1865, in the days of the Reconstruction, until 1960s, 1963, 64, 65, up into 68. 100 years to the dates of the struggle of liberation for the masses of the toiling, oppressed, or should I say exploited African Americans. Why is this? Because if we go back 100 years prior, it appears that the communists was advocating for the African American back then too, even before Martin. And that's why history is important. If you would, let's look at this a bit. Let's go back to 1865. Karl Marx and Abraham Lincoln. So if we look at the communists who were advocating for the freedom of the Negro in the 1860s or in the 1960s, it is very interesting that we can find this advocating also in the 1860s. October 14th, 1865, International Working Men's Association. I'm going to read an excerpt. This is Karl Marx's letter to Abraham Lincoln. Karl Marx began to get he began to be very reputable in Europe for advocating for the laborers and toilers of the world, whether white or black, Asian, whatever. And he was a journalist that wrote in the New York Tribune. And Abraham Lincoln frequented the New York Tribune and reading it. He was acquainted with Karl Marx. And hopefully we can have some discussions on Lincoln as well. Don't get in with an idealistic perspective of Lincoln like he was supposed to carry the people across the finish line. That's not how politics work. All right? It doesn't work that way. It's a gradual movement, periods of rapidity, periods of slower times, rapidity, but all working towards the same goal and will reach the zenith of liberation. But nevertheless, notice this. I want you to put this together, understand the bridge we're building. Just as the FBI built the bridge that the communists are influencing Dr. Martin Luther King, and Martin Luther King can influence other Negro leaders, and these Negro leaders can influence the Negroes. All right, so let's go back and see that the communists and of Martin's day, their teacher, who they would acknowledge as their teacher, Frederick Engels and Karl Marx. Well, Karl Marx himself, who they would call a communist, was an advocate for the African American or the Negro liberation. Now, listen to this. I have the last part of the excerpt on the screen, but I'm going to read to that part. All right. So first, I want to start here. And this, I'm reading these letters out of the Civil War in the United States, Karl Marx and Frederick Engels. And it was edited with an introduction by Andrew Zimmerman. So it says, we have first, this is October, this is the International Working Men's Association. To the people of the United States of America, the working man's advocate, October 14th, 1865. It says, we first We have first to congratulate you that the war is ended and the Union preserved. The stars and stripes, once rudely torn down by your own sons, again flutter in the breeze. So, first, Marx is acknowledging the counter revolutionary aspect of the South, meaning American Revolution was to bring people to freedom, but your own sons have torn down the emblem which actually represented. Your own did it. So he's bringing a railing accusation against those who perpetuate injustice. So he says, the stars and stripes, once rudely torn down by your own sons, again flutter in the breeze from the Atlantic to the Pacific. Never again, we hope, to be insulted by your own children, or again to wave over fields of carnage, either by civil commotion or foreign war. And may those misguided citizens who have displayed courage on the battlefield for an unhallowed cause show equal avidity to aid in healing the breaches they have made. So, as enthusiastic as they were to go to the battlefield for an unhallowed cause, for a despicable cause, Marx is saying let them have that same avidity or that same enthusiasm to aid in the healing of the breaches. Jefferson Davis and the rest of you, the traffickers of human flesh, show the same enthusiasm in healing the breaches that they have made. Karl Marx continues, and in restoring peace to their common country. We have next to congratulate you that the cause of these years of suffering is now removed. Slavery is no more. The dark spot on your otherwise fair escutcheon is blotted out forever. Yeah, that dark spot on your fair badge, your escutcheon badge, hopefully it's blotted out. Marx says, no more shall the salesman's hammer barter human flesh and blood in your marketplaces, causing humanity to shudder at its cold barbarity. Your noblest blood has been shed to wipe out these stains. Desolation has spread its black pall over your land in atonement for its past history. So in other words, all that bloodshed was spilled on the battlefield because of your sins. This is what Marx is arguing. Today, you are free, purified by past sufferings. A brighter future dawns upon your glorious republic. Teaching this lesson to the old world that a government of the people and by the people is for the people and not for a privileged few. So Marx is going in on the injustice, the slavocracy, all those who supported it, and all of the aristocrats who gained wealth off of it, and the merchants who sold flesh and bartered off flesh. And he's condemning these actions. All right. So he's going to say that a government of the people and by the people is for the people and not for a privileged few. Destroy the auction blocks. Destroy the commercial enterprise of slavocracy, which send blood-stained commodities throughout the world. Marx continues, since we have had the honor of expressing sympathy with your suffering, a word of encouragement for your efforts, and of congratulation for the results, permit us also to add a word of counsel for the future. As injustice to a section of your people has produced such direful results, let that cease. Now, notice what he's explaining, because this is the communist arguing. As injustice to a section of your people, which is the Negro, has produced such direful results, which is the stain upon your escutcheon, which is your badge, your decorative plate, that unholy or unhallowed cause that caused carnage in your territory, in your borders. He's saying, as injustice to a section of your people has produced such direful results, your children blood spilled on the battlefields, let that cease. Let your injustice cease. Let social equality reign. Remember what the Klan said? We got to remember what the old Klan was explaining to show you that Karl Marx himself, 100 years prior, argued the same thing. But the FBI and the Ku Klux Klan said, Negroes beware, do not attend communist meetings. Why? Paid organizers for the communists are only trying to get Negroes in trouble. Why is that? How is that? Alabama is a good place for good Negroes to live in, but it is a bad place for Negroes who believe in social equality. And here you are, 100 years prior from King, roughly 80 years prior from his flyer, we have Karl Marx arguing, who is a communist, arguing about social equality for your citizens. And the citizens he's making reference to is the Negro. So I'll read it again. As injustice to a section of your people has produced such direful results, let that cease. Let your citizens of today be declared free and equal without reserve. If you fail to give them citizens' rights while you demand citizens' duties, there will yet remain a struggle for the future, which may again stain your country with your people's blood. Karl Marx saying you better give all of the people in the land their rights, or it's going to be hell to pay. This is what we have among the communists. I mean, put this together. Why don't the Klan want the communists to associate with the Negroes? They told you clearly. Why not? Because the communists want social equality for the Negroes. Is that what Martin wanted? Is that what Karl Marx argued? Now, why is it that the FBI is so hell-bent on, as we're going to read, stifling, sending, as they're going to say themselves, COINTELPRO to hinder or to undermine the work of the communists among the Negroes. And historically, verification has proven they're arguing for social equality, the communists. And we're going to look further into this. Before we close, let's move up from 8. So we looked at Karl Marx's argument. 1865. And for us closing today, we'll revisit it again, God willing. But for today, we're going to look at one. We're going to move up a bit to 1913. 1913. What's happening here? V.I. Lenin, his article, The Russians and the Negroes, 1913. Another communist, before Martin. He is one of the students of Karl Marx. V.I. Lenin is known to put Karl Marx's teachings into praxis or to action, as they led a revolution against the aristocrats and the ruling class in Russia, converting Russia to the USSR. And the USSR and Russia are in the same land, but they are two distinct forms of government. Old Russia was under the capitalist form of government, and some argue Russia today is still a capitalist government. But the USSR, the Union of Soviets, was not a capitalist government, but those are other discussions. But the one who led the revolution, he has something to say about Negroes too. Lenin says, "What a strange comparison." The reader may think, how can a race be compared with a nation? It is a permissible comparison. The Negroes were the last to be freed from slavery, and they still bear more than anyone else the cruel marks of slavery, even in advanced countries. For capitalism has no, quote, room, unquote, for other than legal emancipation. And even the latter, it curtails in every possible way. So in other words, capitalism will not bring emancipation on its own. It's a system of slavery, from antebellum slavery to wage slavery. It's just a system of slavery. And if you're going to get any form of emancipation, you're going to have to do it through legality. It's not just going to happen. The rich will not just give the exploited emancipation because it'll compromise their riches. So you must force it into law. And Lenin is arguing, even once it's in law, the capitalist still curtails it in every possible way. His reference was to who? The Negroes. So thus Lenin says, shame on America for the plight of the Negroes. So whether people realize it or not, the African American or the Negroes then and now have been the center of attention throughout the world. So in order for us to even understand our position today, as some may say, FBA, Foundational Black Americans, whatever you want to call, and that's an interesting argument, which warrants discussion, because you have the world eyes, it is argued, on the so-called African American or Foundational Black Americans. It's maybe, God willing, we will read it in our future discussion on this. It's argued that they are convoked. Word convoked means summoned. That American Negro is convoked to lead the world to freedom, the entire world to freedom, to break the shackles of the rich and ruling class who exploit peoples, who exploit lands, animals. They exploit anything they can get their hands on, land or sea, and even in the air and space. So we're going to look at this, and there's a lot of science behind it. But first, we wanted to show that the FBI files released pertaining to Martin Luther King is something to look into, very important. And it's important because of the historical content and the potential of enlightenment to further the movement that was carried on by Dr. Martin Luther King and those before him. All right. So we're going to close for today's session. We're going to pick this up following through the FBI files. But again, we want to close with what Dr. MLK said, just to put in our memory. And we want to build a bridge to show you how all this was coming together and why he, that is Dr. Martin Luther King, was considered by the FBI to be the most dangerous Negro to national security.
We must also realize that the problems of racial injustice and economic injustice cannot be solved without a radical redistribution of political and economic power.
One most clip for today, and listen carefully.
Bear the heaviest burdens both at the front and at home.
The other thing I want you to understand is this, that it didn't cost the nation one penny to integrate lunch counters. It didn't cost the nation one penny to guarantee the right to vote. But now we are dealing with issues that cannot be solved without the nation spending billions of dollars and undergoing a radical redistribution of economic power.
Yes.
All right. I am, again, Moreh Yehuda, Brother Judah. And I'd like to thank all of you who have taken their time out to tune in to our podcast, What Is to Be Done. We investigate geopolitical, historical, biblical, and social and other scientific content. So far, we are investigating Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. files and his connection with the so-called Communist Party, and investigating it from a historical perspective without all of the commentary per se of what others are saying, demonizing him and demonizing what he believed, but going and gathering the data to understand why the Dr. Martin Luther King and the communists crossed paths. Why was it likely? What mission were they working towards? And also put to rest this idea that Martin Luther King was an atheist. He was not an atheist, but he did question organized religion. So I thank you for your time, and God willing, we will meet again on What Is to Be Done. And with that, all of you who are sincerely searching for truth, may the Almighty open up your eyes and ears and bless your understanding. And all those who have an ear to hear, let them hear.